The narrow band where the sea meets the land is one of the most fascinating and diverse of all ecosystems. Life here has adapted to the pounding of the waves and the alternating of the tides. Many of the organisms living here are covered by water, then left exposed to the air twice each day. Organisms living in this intertidal zone are adapted in unique ways to survive here. Here, between the tides, we observe some of the most fascinating of all life on Earth.
Let's take a look at some of the organisms here in this tide pool. The surf washes in, and as it recedes, water is left behind, and a variety of organisms can live here. Now here's what looks like a little shell that's walking around. In fact, that's a type of snail inside that shell. If we lift it up, we can see in there that there's actually a living thing inside that shell. That living thing makes that shell and uses it to protect itself from other animals that might come along and eat it. If the water goes out too far, it'll clamp down, and by clamping down to the rock, it'll keep itself moist inside until the surf comes back in. Okay, well, here's some interesting creatures here in this little tide pool. Here's a little hermit crab. See if we can get him to come out of his shell. So he lives in the borrowed shell of another organism. This is probably a whelk or some kind of snail that made this shell. Now this hermit crab has decided to live in there to protect himself from someone coming along to eat him. Let's put him back and see what else we see right here. Here we have an anemone, and it stays here in this tide pool until something walks along, comes into the middle of it there, and then it'll close up and try and eat that animal. So it's actually sticking onto my finger. It's got quite a pull on it there. This is actually a critter that has plates in its shell. So it's not just a one-piece shell, but several pieces that work together. Let's look at the other side here. So here's the actual animal underneath, and that shell allows him to bend and move, which is very different from most shells that we find on mollusks here in the tide pool. So this is a chitin, and he can actually clamp down on the rock, and even if the tide goes out, he can stay moist inside because his shell can fit the shape of the rock that he's on.
The giant keyhole limpet covers himself with a soft, slippery mantle from inside his shell. This mollusk crawls along the rocks, grazing on algae attached to the rocks. In pools left by the receding tide, fish like this sculpin hide, eat, and wait for the tide to come back in. This sculpin is very well hidden. His coloration is an adaptation to his life in the tide pools. The sea urchin is a fascinating animal found in tide pools. Hard spines protect the urchin from predators. A sea urchin wanders around the tide pool blindly, searching for food. Its mouth is on the underside of its body. One of the most common animals on the rocks in the tide pools is the mussel. They may look like clumps of rocks, but inside the two halves of their shell is an animal which can extract food from the water. When the tide goes out, the shell clamps together to keep the animal inside from drying out, which is usually how we see them. Sea stars, some people call them starfish, are one of the most famous residents of the tide pools. They are animals, but they are not fish at all. Notice the 5 symmetrical arms